Welcome to another edition of the Energy Week podcast. Ryan Ray alongside Dr. Energy herself, Ellen Wald. Ellen, how's it going today?
Hey, everything is fantastic.
Is it, Ellen? Is it? Because the news seems to be doom and gloom. The world's coming to an end. We're all going to die of the corona beer virus or whatever the proper name is. I can't say it. So
I'm Michelob virus.
Yeah. And stocks.
So I'm not a virologist, but my cursory reading says that coronavirus is a type of virus that people get from weird animals like rats and bats and snakes and things like that. So SARS was a type of coronavirus. However, in solidarity, I will not be drinking Corona beer. Not that this is a hardship.
Well, but. Yeah. So, my dad sent me a message the other day. He said, I guess you're not, going to China anytime soon or something like that. I'm like, this is like Thursday before the news just lost its mind over. I'm like, don't know about that. And what are you talking about? And he goes, do you watch the news? I'm like, actually, I don't actually watch the news. Like I read the news, I check the headlines, I read the stories, but I don't actually watch the news because this is kind of the fever, I guess no pun intended, the fever that you get is, oh my gosh, the world's going to end. And then nothing really happens. And so I told him, I said, I think I sent back something about even Ebola. I think this is a little bit overplayed at the moment. So, Ebola, what was that, been 4 or 5 years ago now that outbreak happened? Ebola.
SARS? I think it was.
No.
Ebola was
Ebola.
Oh, yeah, in Africa.
Oh, yeah. Well, Ebola is really bad, but you don't get it from like coughing on someone. You get it from like touching their bodily fluids. So unless you're like hanging out with a lot of people dying of Ebola and like taking care of them in a hospital, it's very unlikely you'll get it, but it's really, really bad. I mean, you're not planning on going to Wuhan, right? Like I wouldn't go to Wuhan and I wouldn't hang out in the wet market.
I'm not planning to go to Wuhan at the moment, but I guess the point is that if you go back, you remember how Ebola was potentially going to kill us all, and we're flying on planes. And would we have like one death in the U.S. or something like that? I think like 8,000 people died, but it wasn't really. And that person, I think, came over from Africa when it happened.
So I know that there was a big to-do because there were these like doctors and nurses without borders people who were in Africa taking care of these people, and then they came back to the U.S. and like a couple of them I think had Ebola, and then they like rushed them to the CDC, or there was someone in Texas and they like give them these medications, and like I think they all got better mostly, but it's like, I mean, I don't know. It's a big problem. Did you watch? There was a really good mini series, basically based on the book. I think it was called Outbreak. It starred Juliana Margulies and Noah Emmerich, both of whom I love. So I watched the whole thing, and it was basically about this like supposed maybe Ebola outbreak in a monkey research place in DC, and like Juliana Margulies' character is convinced that Ebola is going to infect like everyone in DC. And it turns out like it wasn't, but it was terrifying. It was really good. You should watch it.
Well, hopefully everyone that does have it comes out clear, but it does seem that the markets are really concerned about this. Or are they, Ellen? Are they? This is Ryan puts on his tinfoil hat and goes, the markets need something to react to. Let's take it with this.
It's so funny. Yeah, I mean, the markets have coronavirus? Let's put it like that. Like, have they gotten sick with coronavirus? I think it's, so this article I thought was really interesting, the one from Market Watch, where they're basically looking at like past outbreaks. And I hate the caption. The caption under the picture says, the stock market is trying to shake a deadly coronavirus. History says it tends to do a pretty good job. So I'm going to I'm putting on my historian hat now. History doesn't actually say anything. Like, history is in the past. Historians who interpret historical evidence might say that it does a pretty good job, but history is like totally neutral on everything. Like, a lot of times I like to say that I'm going to get a dog and I'm going to name it History. And then I'm going to be like, no, history doesn't say this. History just barks. Because I'm tired of people saying like history says this. History doesn't like history is totally neutral. It's a historian interpreting it who thinks that it doesn't actually have a big output. Now, one of the interesting things that I would say is like these outbreaks tend to happen in China, and it seems to be because in China, there's a culture of eating these animals, both selling them live in these markets and then also people eating them. So you've got a problem with people handling these wild animals in situations that may not be the most sanitary. Mm-hmm. And then you have people who buy live or dead animals and consume them. And so this virus is apparently can like jump and mutate to humans pretty easily. Mm-hmm. So that's an issue that seems like it's a Chinese, like confined to kind of China. But China has never been such an important part of the global economy as it has been today. That makes slightly convoluted sense. Like, yes, SARS was much worse. Ebola is really bad. Avian flu is bad. MERS in the Middle East was bad. But like it says, SARS killed a lot of people back in like 2003, and it affected oil demand. It affected the economy, but here's the question. Even if coronavirus isn't nearly that bad and doesn't actually kill that many people or whatnot, it doesn't spread or whatever, China is plays a much larger role in the global economy now. So that could in part be why people are anticipating a bigger effect and have such dropped the market. But then you have to consider the fact that, well, people don't make money unless the market moves.
Right.
So they're like, yeah, let's sell off now and then like in 2 weeks, it could be back up to normal without much impact other than speculation, which had a big impact.
So let's talk about SARS for a second. SARS, this is let's see here. There was 8,098 cases, resulting in 774 deaths, according to this from SARS back in 2002 and 2003. So there might be some different numbers somewhere, but just kind of a quick search, it seems to be about 700 to 800 people died when SARS happened. So, I mean, listen, obviously that's very tragic for those people and for their families. I'm not denying that, but if we're being honest, 700 people dying in the grand scheme of the global economy is really not that many people. 8,000 people being sick is not that many people. It's the ancillary impact of people not willing to travel, or they're afraid because they don't go out to the grocery store, or whatever the case may be, businesses having to shut down. Those are really the potential impacts here, because the actual this is 774. So okay, so the overall impact doesn't, from the population standpoint, it's not like the plague, where was it like a third of everyone died or something like that. So we're not talking about that. But we kind of put this plague mentality on, where like a third of the world's going to be gone. What are we going to do? It's like, well, okay, maybe this can be for the folks in China that are sick and their family members died. That's sad and that's tragic. Not denying that, but the reality is it's probably not going to be like the plague, or even close to the plague, or will be remembered in relative comparison to the plague. So therefore, not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. And I need to pull this up, but how many people die from the common flu in the U.S. every year?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the thing. People who are medically fragile, or people or just old people, or people whose immune systems aren't great, can get pneumonia and die from the flu. That's why people are urged to get a flu vaccine. I'm not like making a PSA here, but like the flu is no joke, people.
So according to this, if I'm reading this right, 61,000 deaths annually since 2010. Does that sound right? That sounds a little.
Yeah. Well, so there's a really interesting.
For the flu, that's for the flu. I'm sorry.
Just the flu every year.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The regular flu.
If I'm reading that right, yeah. Go ahead.
So there's a really interesting chart, and then there's a kind of a graph in this article from Market Watch. I definitely urge people to take a look at this, because I'm not going to be able to describe it so great, but they've picked a whole bunch of different epidemics. So they picked HIV/AIDS, and they picked like the month that it supposedly ended. So like June 1981, pneumonic plague, September 1994. I don't remember that. SARS, April 2003, avian flu, June 2006, dengue fever. Like, I don't even remember. Yeah. They really should also put like where these outbreaks were. Like, they have Ebola from March 2014, MERS, cholera. but like I'm assuming like cholera was not a worldwide outbreak. It was in a specific fever, I mean, in a specific area. Excuse me. So like okay, so the measles outbreak in June in 2019, that was like very much. I mean, I remember people being concerned about it in South Florida, but like it wasn't like, like people weren't like not going to the supermarket because of it. People were like, let's not take our immunocompromised babies to like a play space where other children who have not been vaccinated might be hanging out. There's a big difference between that and I know like some schools where there were large concentrations of unvaccinated children were closed, but that's not necessarily something that would really impact the market. And so I think that this so then they measure that against global stock performance, but I'm just not convinced that's like a good, like all of these things are a good measure because like what else was going on in the world at that time? Like, I mean, like there was so much else that was a much more important stuff that was going on that would have affected the market than like, a bunch of people in New York State getting the measles.
Yeah,
so
and I'll say, just to clarify, so it says 12,000 to 61,000 deaths annually since 2010 for the flu. So if you take the low end, 12,000 deaths, that's obviously orders of magnitude larger than where we're at with this disease or any of these other diseases, if I had to guess. And to your point, if you go back, and let me call out some of these dates here. Let's just see. April 2003. Wasn't that roughly around the time we were invading Iraq?
Yeah, like, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, wasn't that...
Wouldn't you go March 03? Yeah. So we now sit in 2002. Yeah, March of 2003. So you have a war that's going on or being launched at that time.
Exactly the same time. Gee, I wonder what was impacting the economy.
Right. Swine flu was in 2009. Isn't that the housing crisis going on around that period of time?
So I remember swine flu because I was teaching at BU. I was a grad student at BU then, and people were very much concerned because when you're teaching college students and they live in dorms and they have horrible hygiene and are around each other all the time. And so basically anyone who had a cold, they basically was like, yes, it's H1N1. You must get, and they sent BU medical students to the campus to vaccinate us all, which was a bit terrifying having some like untrained, medical student vaccinate you. But yeah, it wasn't like I didn't go to the supermarket and I didn't, buy things or if I wasn't buying something, it was because, if there was trouble in my portfolio, I think it was mostly related to the housing crisis.
And there's really a couple ways to measure the loss of potential demand on the market right now, right? So you'd have the kind of very short term, which would be folks aren't driving their cars, things like that. That would be very, very, very isolated incidents. You're not going on vacation, you're not going to the grocery store. You could have where you could see a short-term impact on oil prices, but major movers, and you can't get those back because when you go back to the market next time, you're just going to double buy your groceries. You're not going to make the 3 to 4 trips probably to make it up. So you can see some slight impact, but major economic things like construction and stuff like that you're going to look at. If those projects get shut down and they are on a hard deadline, then they will either have to they will have to work overtime to make up for that, or they'll extend the deadline. But either way, that gets picked back up on some level. So I'm not entirely sure that what 100% what would be lost during this couple weeks or whatever it's going to be. Some of it's lost, but then a lot of it's just picked back up and just kind of slid back a little bit.
Yeah, I think in this very specific case of China, though, it's their Lunar New Year. And so I think that they probably were expecting a huge jump in travel and purchasing. And, imagine if like there was a big outbreak like around Thanksgiving and Black Friday. Would you they say they're like extending the holiday, but I don't know if they're going to get back what was lost for that. So that may be one reason why this in particular might have a larger impact on the Chinese or overall Asian economy, which is now a much larger part of the global economy than it was in 2003. So that's interesting. Like imagine if like New York was stricken with something over Thanksgiving weekend and nobody went out and bought stuff.
Right.
You'd probably have a huge surge in like online retail, obviously, because like people aren't sick enough to not buy things, but it would really hurt a lot of retailers probably.
But so two things. One, let's put this on the record, Nate. Unless there's some major cataclysmic event, I'm predicting by February 10th, this is all back to normal. So unless there's something else that happens between now and February 10th, we can quote me on that. I'll make a prediction, Ellen. Here we go. February 10th, we're all back.
All right.
The market's back. So unless this explodes.
Ryan on the record.
Ryan on the record. The other thing is, let's talk about it from a practical standpoint. Okay. Is anyone shutting in their wells today? Are they not putting a pipeline in that was going to be in? Are they turning valves off? Are tankers just sitting in the Atlantic waiting to move? All of that happens, and it feels like the oil and gas market sometimes is a little bit too overreactive on a day-to-day basis. It's like, guys, you can downgrade the price, but I mean, how much is going to be impacted overall by this? Probably not that much, if at all.
Yeah, especially because, and I argued this actually in my piece on investing.com last week, that think about where Chinese oil demand is coming from. So there's the demand for the products and all the stuff that they're using and jet fuel and all that. But China has also been buying a lot more oil than it's actually using, and they put a lot of it in storage. So if you were China and you were like, oh, the global oil market is falling because of coronavirus, are we actually going to import less oil to correspond with less use from central China, or are we just going to take advantage of the low prices and stick it in our big oil facilities? So you may see there may be a slight, gasoline build or something if China measures that, or a jet fuel build at some point. But are they really going to actually stop buying crude? If you look at how China's strategy is, I would say no, they're just going to sock it away. Right.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was trying to say a minute ago, is that the large industry moving type deals will keep on going. So, and we'll link to those articles in the show notes. So if you're curious about the charts and whatnot, you can see that. I know we have on Dr. Foreman, so we're going to skip ahead here to Platts, because I did want to get your take on this. OPEC eyes deeper cuts to head off impact of China virus. Source, our favorite source. That's what you should get your dog name. Source. Get a dog name. It's Source.
Source. I'm going to have source and history. My real desire is so that I can always sit on the right of my dog, and then I can claim that I'm on the right side of history all the time.
That'd be good. So Ellen, OPEC comes out and says, you know what? We're going to extend these cuts maybe through the end of the year. And this goes back to kind of what I said a minute ago. It's like, well, okay, maybe they will, maybe they won't. But also, if you're OPEC and you're worried about prices dropping a little too low and you want to kind of correct what you think is a overcorrection by the market, you just come out and release this, the markets go, okay, OPEC's not going to do anything. We feel good. And then OPEC could come back in March or June and then just change their mind. I'm not saying they're going to do it or not do it. There's a lot of things. I'm kind of flattening out the implications here, but just from a responding to the market kind of deal, it's like, it doesn't mean anything, actually. It could mean something, but it doesn't.
Yeah, it could, but it doesn't. And I think that obviously Saudi Arabia is going to wait and see what China, because look, China's going to put in their orders for oil from Aramco, and they're going to see if China puts in the same orders, then they're going to say demand is fine, and it's the market overreacting, and then they're going to yell at speculators or whatever. He's going to quote some old movies that no one really understands, and but yeah, so in the eyes and as humor today, I tweeted something. I don't know if you saw this. So someone, an oil reporter I respect, said that, maybe the best thing that OPEC could do would be to tell China to ban bat soup. And that would help demand much more than them saying that they, don't want that they'll maybe cut, or that they'll continue their cuts. That might actually help demand. So I wrote a little letter. I said that, dear China, we will be suspending our oil sales to you until bat soup and other coronavirus causing delicacies have been banned. We'd prefer you not to actively kill off oil demand more than it already is. Thank you for considering our request, in quotation marks. Your friends, OPEC. P.S. This is not an actual embargo. It's just a group of responsible producers doing the right thing.
We're not a cartel.
We're not a cartel. We're a group of responsible producers.
We would never classify ourselves as such a thing. But yeah, that might help. But, so we are monitoring the situation.
Now, one of the things that came up on the Texas Oil and Gas podcast a few weeks ago was Anas came on, and he said that, generally speaking, the Saudis, when a Republican president's in, it's not to do with Trump particularly, but when a Republican president's in, they seem to try to act in a manner that helps keep the prices under control because a Republican president usually means good things for them. So if you kind of weigh that in there, I'm curious your thoughts on that. If you weigh that in there and say that he's right, just to say he's right, then how the Saudis may act as the presidential election season goes along might change if all of a sudden the prices start to shoot up, and it might be more of a political aspect than necessarily a fundamental aspect. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that there's a lot that I don't know. I know that Anas very much believes that there's a serious political element here, and I'm not going to say that politics doesn't play a role, but I think that in some cases the role of like these political considerations can get overblown, particularly because people want to think that like the United States is super important to OPEC or like have it, Saudi Arabia's relationship with an American president is like so super important. I mean, I'm not saying it isn't important because we did see, in not last summer, but the summer before when prices were getting close to 80 and Trump starts tweeting all this stuff like OPEC, you're, bad OPEC with your cuts, and then Saudi Arabia and Russia get together and they're like, okay, we're going to relax the cuts and like produce more. Was he like threatening them? Was he, do they just want to be on his good side, or do they really not want to let oil prices get much over 80 because they don't want to like kill demand? It's a balancing act. And so I don't think that you can necessarily always read a political consideration into this. I actually had a really interesting conversation with some people when I was in Abu Dhabi and this one person was arguing that instead of coming out and saying for Aramco after those attacks that the Saudis should not have come out and said, we're fixing it, it'll be back up in like 3 days, but that they should have like played it up a little more and like not fixed it in order to show the policymakers in Washington how important Saudi Arabia really is to the oil market and to kind of play that card. And, that she's like, they should have done that because then the market wouldn't react like this and they would kind of show them that they're really important in keeping oil prices low. And, I personally disagree with that because I think that would have really harmed Aramco's reputation, especially because it obviously would have come out that they knew, later on it would have come out that they could have repaired it faster, but they didn't just for political. So I think that's like, that's like a little, not that it's conspiracy theory-ish, but it forgets that, there are business relationships that have to be maintained and money is really important here.
Yeah, and I think maybe a way to think about it is that if we're making fun of the market because it's plummeting because of the outbreak, there probably are people who are trading who legitimately are concerned about the outbreak and the impact.
Oh yeah.
So, but then there's probably a large portion who look at this as a dollars and cents deal. Go, you know what? If we can get the market down, we can sell it and short it and then buy it back up. And so, all of these things, when you think about it, there are. Maybe there's a political element to it. Maybe there's not. How much of that weighs into it. And sometimes it feels like when we talk about these things, I think this is kind of the problem that cable news has brought on is you got 5 minutes, you got to have your talking point. Here it is, and you just kind of pound that talking point home. And life is just nuanced. And so probably somewhere, I don't know if in the middle is the right way, but somewhere there. So let's see what else we can get to before we get to Dr. Foreman. This is from Yahoo. Why that green fund you bought might include a coal miner. Oh, and Nate, linked to this as well. There was a, let's see here, a podcast from the New York Times talking about union members in Western Pennsylvania who are concerned about voting for Warren or Bernie because of their potential ban on fracking and the loss on jobs.
Oh.
And so...
Oh, let's talk about that instead of this, actually, because I had an interesting conversation with someone about this. Okay. And then I went and I asked some Democratic voters in Pennsylvania what they thought. So, okay. So here's some interesting information about fracking in Pennsylvania. So they have a special tax, a drilling tax on fracking in Pennsylvania. And that tax, along with all the other taxes that they put on it, has generated a lot of money that the state kind of gives out. Now, okay, maybe your definition of a lot of money depends. They have at least, like in 2018, I think they had $209 million. And so Pennsylvania, which is a state controlled by mostly Democrats, although there's different kinds of Democrats in Pennsylvania, they're kind of like this conservative Catholic pro-union types, and then there's like the Philadelphia brand, and they're very different, but whatever. That's Pennsylvania politics. And communities get this money, like they dispense it. Like even Philadelphia gets this money, because like they get, even though there's no fracking in southeastern Pennsylvania, it's like a thing for the state. And they also have this fund called like the Marcellus Legacy Fund that they can use that they can give grants to do like environmental projects and greenway refurbishment, all sorts of stuff. So great for politicians, right? Because they get control of this money. So I had a reporter ask me this question. She's like, if there aren't a lot of jobs, fracking doesn't generate that many jobs in the state, and like not a lot of people are in unions, like, so why do people, like, why is this an issue? And so I said, well, there's a lot of money. It generates money for the state that Democrats control. She's like, okay, but what about Pennsylvania voters? Like, do they care? Pennsylvania voters who say they care about the environment, would they support a ban on fracking? Okay. So I asked someone who is a serious environmentalist voter in Pennsylvania, like works for the, I don't want to say which work, but like this is like a thing she cares about a lot. Mm-hmm. And her response was, and I'm going to quote her response what she thinks.
This is our source. Ellen Wald takes down environmentalist source.
Why would anyone who cares about the environment support extraction of fossil fuels? It's not that much money in taxes. It's pathetic how little the state taxes the industry. Okay. Then I asked some other Pennsylvania voters, also registered Democrats, who definitely care about the environment, but it's not like their life's work. Okay. What are the implications of a total ban on fracking? We would need to educate ourselves on the issue first. So there you have it. So is this an issue for voters? Could be, but might not be. Some people might happily go along with it, and other people might be like, whoa, hold on a minute.
Right. And these people were, if I remember correctly, coal miners, union members who I think were in the coal industry, and now they're kind of working for the oil and gas industry. And from their standpoint it was like, okay, if these jobs are gone, then where do we go from here? Like there are no green jobs for us to take. Where do we go? And so, I'm not saying that's enough of the electorate to swing it, but Pennsylvania is a swing state. And so, the fear.
It's a serious swing state.
Yeah. So the fear of losing, some of your workforce if you do get, Sanders or Bernie in there. I was just surprised because, and they weren't saying that they would vote for Trump. They were just saying that they wouldn't vote. It was kind of more of the vibe that you got. That they just wouldn't vote. But if they voted for Hillary, I think, to a person last time. So you take however many Hillary votes you had last time, and you start losing some of those. That could be disastrous, potentially, if it's enough. Obviously, I think you're right. It's going to be a varying degrees. Of course, if I think Biden hadn't said that, so if Biden wins, then it won't be as big of a deal.
I mean, I can see Biden. I can see like Biden is exactly the kind of. I mean, at least he was before he started saying like different things than he used to say, but he was exactly the kind of like Democrat that goes in Pennsylvania. I don't know. I don't know. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting. I did a little totally, non-scientific poll there.
To be fair, it's probably as much scientific as all the other polls we see from the media. So don't worry. It's not. You were probably in step with a lot of other folks that do polls and claim to be gospel. Okay, so we will link to that podcast in the show notes if you want to hear. It's the New York Times Daily Digest podcast, and I listen to it every now and then, and I just happened to catch that one. I didn't even realize that's what the topic would be. I found it interesting because if you're going to lose a voter to a non-vote, that's not even turning them. You're just losing them to a non-vote. That's a pretty tough way to go there if you're a Democratic candidate. And hey, what are we, 2 weeks from Iowa?
Yeah, it's coming up really fast.
Wow, that's crazy. It feels like we talked about the elections for so long, and then what are we going to talk about after this election's over? Because if Trump loses, he's not going to run again. He'd be too old. If he wins, then what do you talk about?
Yeah. I don't know. If he wins, Trump, the demise of the Democratic Party. I don't know.
All right, and making his first appearance of the new year, Dr. Dean Foreman with the American Petroleum Institute. Dr. Foreman, how's it going, sir?
Doing great. Ryan, Ellen, thanks for having me again. How are you?
Doing well. We were just breaking down the impact of the world as this pandemic is taking us all over. So we were talking about that and kind of going through the news of the day. So let's get into y'all's statistical report, which will come out has come out on the 23rd, I guess. It came out last week. So we will link to that in the show notes so folks can go take a look at it. Let me tell you where I started off. What caught my attention was two things. One, record petroleum exports of 9 million barrels a day, and then also under the demand highlights, under the December highlights, demand, U.S. petroleum demand in December slowed in December and for 2019, and you kind of go through a handful of things there. So we've got record exports, but we're seeing U.S. demand slowing down. Kind of paint that narrative for us, and sometimes you would hear those things. You might think they're together, but they're not.
Glad to. So we're talking, just to be clear, we're talking about U.S. petroleum market figures. So this isn't global. But what we saw was, despite a year-on-year decrease in demand, if we're going to start with the bad news, if you will, it's still close to record levels. It's come off very fractionally from record levels, really, the year prior. So if we're looking at 2019 as a whole, it's really not a bad story, but there is a divergent story in terms of motor fuels having slowed fractionally, and then most of the growth having been driven by jet fuel, which could be affected by the pandemic. And then secondly, the biggest source of growth has been this investment in expansion, refining, and petrochemicals. So we've seen a lot of industrial use of liquid fuels going into naphtha, gas oil, everything that we want is really made of. So as that's continuing, that's a really good story, and that's not likely to abate. In fact, given that there are more refining and petrochemical expansions that are being completed as we speak, that should be a continued source of growth going forward. Now, the exports of 9 million barrels per day total, that's crude oil and refined products together. That's a record, despite the fact that the product side has pulled off a bit. So crude oil exports surged almost 500,000 barrels per day just between November and December. So this shows you, even before the U.S.-China trade deal was endorsed, that there's a lot of upside here and a potential growth into 2020 from a global liquids market, oil market perspective, where they're just, as the economy expands, recession or not, as the economy expands, we expect continued growth in oil demand, and that's playing out. So we've got demand and the exports covered. The third leg of the stool is really production, and that was the other big record. So we saw a record 12.9 million barrels per day of crude oil produced in the United States, number one in the world again. That, coupled with the fact that EIA's tracking of the productivity trends remain solid, BTU Analytics tracking of the break-even prices in producing it remain low. So this is, despite what's happening with slowing drilling activity, it really is a good story for continued production growth into this year.
So let me ask you one more thing here. Let's talk about inventories. You're on your accumulation for 14 consecutive months. Obviously, how much oil we have and where is this going, is something that we talk about on a regular basis. It seems like, but 14 consecutive months, that's a long streak. How does that compare to maybe other historical streaks that we've seen? Is this kind of a record long streak, or is this normal to kind of see this accumulation over that period of time?
I haven't done the temporal comparison to see if it's a record, but it definitely is an extension of an accumulation that seasonality aside, driving seasons aside, this is a really underlying trend driven by just phenomenally strong production growth as we've seen this last year. We should expect production growth off of these highs to slow this year and next. EIA's outlook shows that. And then you'd expect the inventory accumulation to kind of normalize. But to put this in perspective, what we saw as of December was right kind of in the middle of the 5-year range. So it's not, despite the fact that we had this year-on-year growth in the accumulation of inventories, it's not abnormal, if you will. It's in that range that isn't going to rock the market one way or the other.
So I've got a couple questions. One of them is, crude oil exports, you say, are up. Just out of curiosity, do you look at where these exports are going mostly? Are we still, exporting to the same countries, or, is there a large, range of countries that are buying U.S. crude oil? And do you think that this is increased because of the IMO 2020 regulations?
I can't really relate it directly to IMO 2020, and we didn't see a huge impact through the fourth quarter last year of that yet. We'll have to look at first quarter data to see if the implementation really changed the pattern of things. But the underlying trend, and the bigger one of the latter half of 2019, was this continued dearth of buying from China as they were creating more negotiating leverage, having turned off their purchases. And China historically turns on and off its purchases anyway as part of negotiating tactics. But here, with those turned off, the U.S. was finding other markets, and there was a lot of growth across Asia, across Latin America, across Europe for U.S. crude oil and refined products. As China should come back into the fold, and this was emerging at the time that we're publishing this last week, but the details now suggest that above and beyond a 2017 baseline, this phase one China-U.S. trade deal basically requires that China commit to purchasing some $18 billion worth of energy, including coal, refined products, some refined products, not all that you would think of, crude oil, as a combined bucket, and then a total of $30 billion incremental by year 2. So you really are looking at a $52 billion commitment over 2 years. So we've been trying to take this apart and understand the implications of what does it mean from a U.S. energy perspective to have a single buyer committed to buying an incremental $50 billion worth of energy. And when you piece it apart and start saying, well, how much is that? How do you move the needle and get $50 billion worth of commitments and not have them look back in a year or two and say, U.S., you just couldn't step up and deliver this. Sorry, we tried. And if we're really looking as an industry at trying to meet that and be prepared to meet that, the things that do kind of pop off the page, one is that you're talking, 500,000 barrels to 1 million barrels per day more oil to be in that nexus. You're talking about a lot more LNG, 50, 100 cargoes over a couple of years. Coal won't really move the needle for you on that. So, and the refined products, though, in the aggregate, you would think of refined products as being more valuable than crude oil because you refine them to add value to it, right? But the mix of refined products that China actually buys from the United States are really heavy on naphtha as a wholesale product and on propane, liquid petroleum gases. So when you start looking at the fact that China's specific refined product purchases have tended to be at a discount to crude oil because of the products involved, you really look at crude oil as being the product that can really move the needle the most in meeting those commitments, both in terms of market penetration, fungibility, and availability. But then we look at, and this is an issue we've talked about on this podcast a couple of times over the last year, is that the U.S. can only export so much crude oil, and the estimates of that are between 4 and 5 million barrels per day in total. And here we are, as of December, having seen a surge from 3.1 to 3.6 million barrels per day already of crude oil. So that doesn't leave a lot of headroom before we're entering this range where the market says there's only so much the U.S. can export, which which really increases the urgency in turn of getting crude oil export projects moving forward.
So what about, so does that leave, are LNG producers basically like jumping up and down for joy because they might get real contracts out of this? Or are we assuming that, coal mining is going to get, like coal is going to get a jump? I mean, where's this extra, what's the next best thing after crude oil?
Well, this is one where I'd like to say I really don't know the answer of how it's going to play out. The sentiment from the LNG side before the trade deal was signaling to the U.S. trade representatives that, hey, we're able to place LNG cargoes globally without China jumping on board. So, there could be natural limits to how much and when, but at this point, they haven't had any problems getting contracts and underpinning the new projects and getting started. So that market's really been going gangbusters even without China on board. Now that you put China on board, it's a fair question whether there's enough, one, spot cargoes, like extra cargoes that are available to be redirected or purchased by China. And secondly, things, just thinking about the shipping implications of this in the Panama Canal. Let's go there for a second. The Panama Canal has an informal restriction, at least, that it won't let more than about 4 LNG ships go through it at once, simultaneously, through all of the locks. So how many of these cargoes really physically can go to China, given, one, that the ship size is, formerly the Panamax was the largest ship that could go through there. As they widened the canal in 2016, It was the Neo-Panamax. There are only so many of those ships that exist, and only so many LNG ones can go through at a time. So if you're going to take the long route, inefficiently shipping around the southern cone of South America to go to Asia, suddenly your shipping costs go up an awful lot for LNG. So there are a lot of other logistical implications of how the market will sort out here that aren't altogether clear exactly how they'll get sorted. The one thing that is clear is that if China's going to meet these commitments, they probably have to become one of, if not the largest single trader of U.S. energy. So it's an interesting question then of, because it's not in the letter of this phase one trade deal, here's the question. Is trading a way of satisfying this import requirement for China or not? I don't know the answer to that yet, but that's part of the discussion that has to be had, and maybe a discussion between phase one and phase two agreements.
So, real quick, on the export issue, there is talks, very early stage talks about looking at different ways to circumvent the Panama Canal and going around South America. That I've been in some rooms and heard some things, and so hopefully, maybe we'll see how those talks go, and maybe next year later this year, have a little bit more to report. But there is, I know there's a lot of interest. It's a just from the folks that I've come across and talked to, it's so many things. We kind of say, well, you gotta get a permit or you gotta get this, but you've got to get the contracts, you get the producers, you get the pipeline. There's so many moving parts that it's kind of hard to kind of have all the ducks in a row, if you will, and then take it down. But some of those talks are happening on how to handle this, and hopefully some of those things that they're looking at will get done. So I'm curious about that. But you are right. There are a lot of problems, but to do it a new way actually. It would be more efficient, but to get there actually there's so many problems to get it done the new way that it takes a long time to do that as well. So it's kind of the the devil right now. And then it's like, okay, well, we're going to try to solve it doing this, but then there's a lot of problems we have to work through on that as well. So
to be clear on the tone, though, I think it's a good problem to have.
Oh, it's a great problem. Yes.
The fact that this agreement's moved forward and it signals a de-escalation of trade tensions between U.S. and China and potentially globally, that's a great thing. So ultimately, this should be beneficial for global growth, for energy exports, across the board. So we'll see how it plays out.
Right. I guess the only thing I'm saying, my only point was just more for the general listener. They go, well, why don't they just figure out something new? Was this not as simple as saying, hey, we're going to do this. If you want to build an LNG plant, you got the permits. We also have the permits. Well, that's one thing. You got to get pipelines. You got to get producers. You got to get commitments, and that all sounds easy. When you start putting it together, there's just so many moving parts. So that's part of the reason why some of these solutions haven't been taking place. But anyways, sorry, I didn't mean to derail, but I just thought that was worth looking ahead to maybe.
Ryan, maybe another thing to throw on as a good news story out of this. The Wall Street Journal had an article this last week saying that the natural gas market in the United States is broken. And, it's not broken. It's actually the largest and most competitive in the world at this point. And what's happening is to support these prospective LNG exports, we really are seeing a ramping up. You can't incrementally produce like a new incremental billion cubic feet per day of natural gas for exportation without ramping that drilling program up over time, right? So, here we are with, and to put it in perspective, going all the way back 45 years on record for Henry Hub natural gas. So far, this is the lowest January we've ever seen. And it's phenomenal, and it's happening largely because of the need to support these exports. And it is evidence that we're not cannibalizing domestic production as it happens, and it is incrementally adding growth.
So let me ask you this question. Last year, I kind of joked about the 5-year range, but now that we're through the year, I'm looking at some of the charts, and and if you look back historically to last year, we were outside the 5-year range for the whole year. So if you just look at that, you go, oh, wow, we're outside the 5-year range. Well, we've had a whole year outside the 5-year range. So the 5-year range now, that 5th year is gone, and that's now part of the 5-year range, which means as we look at data moving forward, for the last 5 years, which would be 2019 moving back, the 5-year range looks different, and how we perceive those charts will be different. Does that have, just as an economist, does that have any impact on how people will feel about the market? Because you had the line, this far outside, I'm doing my hands, the listeners can't see, but you're well outside the 5-year range, and now you're just going to be substantially closer or maybe inside the 5-year range. How do the markets or people who look at this and they look at those kind of numbers, is there anything we should consider moving forward? Because for the simpleton like me, I just see red lines. I'm like, oh, okay, colors. But for the smarter folks who actually analyze this stuff, what impact might that have?
That's a great question. And I thought about your feedback a couple of months ago on the subject of, should we be changing our graphic format on crude oil and NGL production in particular for it? And we've kept it to be consistent because the monthly statistical report, which we plan next month to revise the format of this and refresh it a bit, but the graphics are kind of your tried and true friend, where once you're familiar with it, you get it. And the EIA historically for inventories and other things has used kind of current year compared with a 5-year range, so you can get that calibration. The nice thing about this is at a glance, you get this year compared with last and compared to a 5-year range. And it isn't that the 5-year range, it will be, you're right, month over month as we cross over, we're going to update those 5-year ranges historically and see a different comparison, including now, this next month, we should see all of 2019 into our history. But it then increases the optics of just how much variance we've seen and where the current year is in a relative strength sense. So it does suggest that the bar is going to move higher as we're into 2020 relative to a 2019 that in many ways set many records. But
yeah, I guess I'm looking at going, people, as this year progresses, they may look at it and go, okay, well, maybe we're breaking a record, maybe we're not. But compared to, okay, we're right outside the 5 year. It's not that big of a change. Whereas last year, it seemed like everything was, we're kind of blowing the wall off of the top off everything. And so it kind of, the way the visualization was, it really felt orders of magnitude larger. Well, this year, it'd either be right outside the range or right above it. And people they're just going to respond how they see the data probably a little bit different, I would guess. Again, red, green, colors, boxes, that's just, for us simpletons over here in Texas, that's how we look at things.
You're right. And I think just this concept of flowing from the mountaintop, the fact that we've gotten to some records and that it's going to be harder from point forward to continue to set those records, especially with slowing drilling activity. This should peel off a bit, and then we'll have to focus on a different story. Hopefully not all downside, but as we're looking at slowing drilling, you'd expect some normalization of those growth rates for production going forward. The DUCs, as we've talked about, the drilled but uncompleted wells, those are now, over the latter half of last year, down by 10%. So as by EIA estimates, down 10%, which means that those have been coming to market and continue to do so as the pipes have expanded out of the Permian Basin, going to refiners and exports along the Gulf. So more to come here, but it is, again, a good story from this mountaintop.
Ellen, do you have anything? If not, I have a duck question.
Oh, I wanted to ask you, one of the interesting things you talked about gasoline utilization varying regionally. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what those, you said, gasoline deliveries. Sorry, gasoline deliveries slowed but diverged regionally. I was wondering if you could talk about what those regional divergences looked like.
So, we look at conventional versus reformulated gasoline, and as urban areas have been more emission sensitive, the reformulated gasoline has been kind of the mainstay for those areas, and then conventional gasoline for everywhere else pretty much. And in terms of volumes, the reformulated, we're talking about 3 million barrels per day and change, and the conventional is like 6 million barrels per day and change. So roughly, we look at both to kind of see what the demand pattern's been. And we have been seeing some changes where over time we've seen more decline on the urban side than on the conventional rural side. And as that's happening, so for 2019, here we had U.S. gasoline demand decreased 0.4% year over year overall, but it was a 2.3% decrease in the reformulated gasoline, the urban gasoline. And actually increased on the conventional side. And interestingly, increased by 0.5% year over year on the conventional side, the larger amount of gasoline, despite the fact that we had all of this trade pressure and agriculture downturn across the Midwest. So it actually is a pretty strong story given the trade and the agriculture backdrop and Midwest manufacturing backdrop that went with it.
Interesting.
Dr. Foreman, before we let you go, one final thing to consider before your next appearance. We found out that we are the #1 podcast in Kazakhstan. So before your next appearance, if you could bring us some good numbers for those people, they would probably appreciate it. So just throwing that out there. If you have some good import-export numbers for Kazakhstan before your next appearance, that would be spectacular. I think they're going to make Ellen and I like president for a day or something. They haven't said that officially, but I'm just kind of reading between the lines there. So just something to consider.
We're totally expecting celebrity status in Kazakhstan.
Yes, that's what we're hoping for. So,
well, congratulations. I'm kind of reminded of that 1980s song, Big in Japan.
Can we make that our theme song now? the outgoing music.
Yeah. So for next month, if you could have a little Kazakhstan tidbit for those folks, that would be much appreciated. If not, that's fine too. But just, we're trying to be people of the people. So, Dr. Foreman, anything we missed or anything before now and next month that you might be attending or doing that you want to tell folks about?
It's just been a really busy start to the year. So I spoke at the SAE industry government meetings, and this was attached to the Washington Auto Show. So really interesting things looking at electric vehicles and energy transition. I'll be speaking come Wednesday at the American Institute of Iron and Steel. So a lot of trade associations coming up. The Argus Crude Oil Summit on February 5th in Houston. So making the circuit round.
Oh, cool. Well, good deal. And folks can connect with you on LinkedIn, I'm sure, and see where you are all at. And I think you're on Twitter as well. So we'll link to that. Dr. Foreman, it was good to have you on, and we will talk to you again next month.
Excellent.
See you later.
Ryan, thanks so much.
So I was thinking we should include a little Kazakhstan-related news at the end for our favorite Kazakhstani listeners.
Let's see if you'll give us. Yeah.
So we should talk about the fact that Kazakhstan has halted the sale of its contaminated crude oil to China. It was contaminated with organic chloride, and in order to prevent major contamination disaster like we saw happen, with crude from Russia, the Kazakhstan, halted deliveries, and I think that they probably saved China a lot of money and issues here. So kudos to them for getting on top of this early. Yeah,
and do you have like a little thumb analogy or pinky toe that you use to describe where Kazakhstan is? Because
like the banana and the thumb and Central Asia.
It's like in the center of Asia, basically. Like it borders China and Russia, and it's just right there.
So fun fact: Kazakhstan used to be an Soviet socialist republic, so it was part of the Soviet Union, and now it is, of course, its own republic and has its own oil industry. And I can also tell you that there was a Kazakhstani figure skater who won, I think, a medal at the World Championships last year. Okay. So go Kazakhstani figure skating. And
it is the northernmost of all the Stan countries as well. So there you go. There we go. So Kazakhstan, we love you. Send cash, gift cards, plane trips, whatever. Well, we love you guys. So anyways.
Download our podcast.
I mean, we're number one, so just keep it up.
Keep it up.
Tell all the surrounding Stan countries as well. That'd be nice. Pakistan. If we were number one in Pakistan, that'd be nice.
That would be huge.
That'd be huge.
Azerbaijan, not a Stan country. Turkmenistan.
Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan.
They're just to the south there.
Yeah. So, Ellen, where will you be this week? Not Kazakhstan.
Let's see. Not Kazakhstan. Unfortunately, I would love to travel there, but I will not be there. I will be on Forbes. I will be on investing.com. And I may be in the Washington Post. We'll see how that goes. So,
will you be talking about how you have 4 degrees and that makes you the expert on something?
No, I will not. I will be talking about, I will probably be writing about whether Saudi Arabia is really an ally of the United States and where this kind of myth of Saudi Arabia and the U.S.'s so-called intimate relationship came from.
Okay. 30-second rant, Washington Post. If you hear something you don't like and you call a guy who has 4 degrees and you get his opinion and it refutes the other opinion, that actually doesn't mean anything. I know that you journalists don't understand that, but that actually doesn't mean a single thing. It means you have 2 people who disagree. One of them has 4 degrees.
It means someone who spent a lot of time in school, wasted a lot of money, or got a lot of scholarships, and probably made some poor life choices. I mean, I honestly don't consider having. Okay, I guess I have 3 degrees, and I'm not considering the fact that I have these 3 degrees an example of something that one should do. I would not necessarily recommend that as a good life choice. So, and it definitely doesn't mean I'm smarter. It just means that I didn't want to go in the real world. I want to just stay in the ivory tower.
It was just funny because it was an economics debate, and it's like, well, we contacted an economist with 4 degrees. I'm like, you do realize there's multiple types of economists with multiple theories about how the economy works. You probably don't. You probably actually don't realize that. So Washington Post, get it together. I'm a subscriber. Don't make me mad at you. So Ellen, you are at least smarter than me. You have that going. The bar is not very high, but you have that for today and more. 3 times the degrees I have. So there you go. You've got me on all fronts. I will.
But like I said, that doesn't mean much.
I will share the glory of being number 1 in Kazakhstan with you, though. We will split that equally. Everything else you can have. Ellen, it was good to be back next week, right? Yeah, back on normal schedule. So be back next week. Thanks, Dr. Foreman. And listeners, thank you. And until next time, we'll talk. I forgot how to close the show out, so bye. How about that?
Until next week, listeners.
Bye.